Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain. Chapter 1. The Pauper. In 1537, two boys were born on the same day in London. Tom Canty was born to a poor family of paupers. They lived in one room near Pudding Lane, a poor neighbourhood near London Bridge.
"Another child,"
said Tom's father when he saw the baby.
"Another mouth to feed."
He was not happy. No one wanted Tom. The other baby was Edward Tudor, Prince of Wales. His father was Henry VIII, King of England. They lived at Westminster Palace.
"A prince is born! A handsome prince is born!"
cried everyone at Westminster Palace.
"Let's have a big celebration with fireworks and a banquet. My son is born,"
said the king happily. All of England was happy and celebrated the arrival of the baby prince. 13 years later, Tom was begging for money on the streets of London. His clothes were old and full of holes, and he had no shoes. He was thin and dirty. He lived with his mother, grandmother, and two sisters, Bet and Nan. The children had no beds and slept on the cold floor. They were always hungry. Tom's father, John Canty, never did any work. He sent Tom out to beg every day of the year. Sometimes people felt sorry for Tom and gave him a little money. But other times, he did not get anything. When he did not bring any money home, his father hit him. "I don't want to always be poor," thought Tom. "I want to learn to read and write, and I want to know about the world." Father Andrew was a kind old priest with white hair. He was Tom's friend and lived in the same building. "Can you help me, Father Andrew?" Tom asked. "I want to read and write, and I want to speak good English, like princes and important people."
"I can help you, Tom,"
said Father Andrew.
"Come to my room every day."
He taught Tom to read and write, and he taught him Latin. He told him stories about kings and princes. Tom learnt quickly and soon read Father Andrew's books. At night, he often dreamed about the people in those books. When Tom was with other boys, he liked playing at being a prince. The other boys laughed at him and called him Prince Tom, but they liked him. They jumped in the mud and swam in the river. One day, Father Andrew said,
"Tom, why don't you go to Westminster Palace and see the real prince? Prince Edward is the king's son. Perhaps you can see him at the palace."
Chapter 2. The Pauper meets the Prince. The next morning, Tom went to Westminster Palace and stood outside the big gate. There were two tall soldiers there. He looked at the splendid palace, but he could not go near it. He went back the next day and saw important ladies and gentlemen going to the palace, but he never saw the prince. Then, one day, he went back there again and saw a boy in very fine clothes. "That looks like the prince!" thought Tom excitedly. He ran to the gate.
You can't come in here.
The soldiers cried and hit Tom. The prince saw this and did not like it.
Why did you hit the poor boy?
Asked Edward.
Open the gates and bring him in.
But, sir,
Said the soldier.
he's only a dirty beggar.
My father is the king of rich people and poor people.
Answered Edward. The soldiers opened the gate and brought Tom in.
Come with me.
Edward said kindly. He took Tom inside the big palace with its long stairs and beautiful rooms. When they reached the prince's rooms, Edward called a servant.
Bring food,
He ordered.
meat, bread and fruit.
Tom was very hungry and he ate the food quickly.
Now,
Said the prince, smiling.
what's your name? Where do you live?
My name's Tom Canty, and I live with my family in a room near Pudding Lane.
In one room?
Said the prince.
Do you all live in one room?
Yes,
Said Tom.
There are hundreds of rooms here.
Said the prince.
I have 5 rooms.
we're very poor.
Said Tom.
My father doesn't work, and I have to beg for money. When I don't bring money home, he hits me.
Oh, your father hits you.
Said the prince.
I'll send my soldiers to your house and they'll put him in prison.
No, please, sir.
Said Tom.
Think of my mother and sisters.
I understand.
Said the prince kindly.
I have 2 sisters, Lady Elizabeth and Lady Mary. Lady Elizabeth is very nice, but I don't like Lady Mary. She never laughs or smiles. I also have a cousin, Lady Jane Grey. She's my age and is very kind. But I don't know any boys. Do you play with other boys?
Of course I do.
Said Tom.
I don't.
Said the prince sadly.
What do you play?
We play by the river, swim and jump in the mud.
Said Tom.
Sometimes we play princes and soldiers, and other times we play ball. We dance and sing and make a lot of noise too. We always have great fun.
I want to play by the river and swim and jump in the mud once in my life. But I can't because I'm a prince.
Said Edward sadly. He looked out of the window and then said suddenly,
I've got an idea. Look in the mirror. You and I are the same. You're like me and I'm like you.
The 2 boys were both thin. They had the same brown hair, the same brown eyes, the same nose, the same mouth, and the same voice. They were also the same height. They were almost identical. The prince was excited.
Let's change clothes. You'll be the prince and I'll be the pauper for a short time. It'll be a game. A wonderful game. Take off those old clothes and put on my clothes. We can both be happy for a short time.
Tom washed his face and put on the prince's elegant clothes. Then Edward put on Tom's dirty old trousers and shirt. Now Edward was Tom, and Tom was Edward. They looked at each other in the big mirror and laughed loudly.
Stay here until I come back,
Said the prince happily.
I want to be a pauper for an hour. I'm going to swim in the river and jump in the mud with the other boys.
Before leaving, he took something big and round from the table. He went to a corner of the room and put it inside an old Italian suit of armour. Then he ran out of the door.
But what will I do?
Tom asked himself. Chapter 3. Changing Places. The prince went to the gates of the palace.
Open the palace gates quickly,
He ordered. The soldiers opened the gates and Edward went out. One of the soldiers hit him on the head.
Don't give orders to the king's soldiers, boy.
Edward fell to the ground and said,
I'm Prince Edward, Prince of Wales.
Well, then I'm the King of England.
said the soldier, laughing.
You can go to prison for that.
Said Edward angrily. His face was red. The crowd laughed loudly and said,
He's
mad!
Edward walked down the road angrily. He forgot about playing by the river and walked in the streets of London. This was his first walk in the city. He was soon lost and tired. His feet hurt a lot because he had no shoes, and his stomach hurt because he was hungry.
I must go back to the palace.
He thought. He stopped people and said,
Show me the way to Westminster Palace.
He never said, please, because he was the prince. Some people laughed at him, and others were angry because he was not polite. But no one helped him.
This is terrible,
he thought.
I'm hungry and cold, and I don't know where to sleep tonight. Tom's house is near Pudding Lane. Perhaps Tom's mother and sisters will help me.
Edward walked for a long time in the dark, dirty streets. There was a bad smell everywhere. Then it started to rain, and it was cold. Edward was unhappy. Suddenly, he felt a big, heavy hand around his arm.
What are you doing out at this time, Tom Canty?
Asked a big man.
Where's the money from your day's work?
Ouch! You're hurting me.
Cried Edward.
Are you his father?
His father? I'm your father, you stupid boy.
Said John Canty, hitting Edward.
No! No!
Cried Edward.
I'm Edward, the Prince of Wales. Your son is in Westminster Palace. He's wearing my clothes and I'm wearing his clothes. We changed places. It was a game. Take me to the palace.
John Canty looked at the boy with cold eyes and said,
You're mad. Mad.
He took Edward's arm and pulled him down the road.
You're coming home with me, and tomorrow morning you can start work early and bring some money home.
At the palace, Tom was alone in the prince's room. He looked at himself in the big mirror on the wall and liked his new clothes. He looked at all the beautiful things around him. Pictures of kings, queens, princes and princesses. Lovely chairs and tables. Beautiful glasses and cups. And big plates full of fruit. He touched the prince's sword and played with it for a while. He was happy in the prince's room and liked playing this new game. But after an hour, he was tired of it, and he began to feel afraid.
Where is the real prince? He thought. Why isn't he back? I must look for him.
He opened a big door and saw 4 gentlemen. They bowed to Tom.
Oh!
cried Tom, and shut the door quickly.
How strange!
One gentleman said.
The prince is probably ill.
Let's call his sisters, or Lady Jane,
said the second gentleman. A beautiful young woman with a kind face opened the door. It was Lady Jane Grey. Tom was afraid and went down on his knees.
Please save me, kind lady,
said Tom.
I'm not Prince Edward. My name's Tom Canty, and I'm a pauper. Prince Edward and I change clothes. He's wearing my dirty old clothes, and I'm wearing his beautiful clothes. Please find the prince so I can get my clothes back. Oh dear, you're ill, Edward,
Lady Jane said.
Please come with me. Your father wants to see you. My father? Is John Canty here?
asked Tom. Lady Jane did not answer him.
The king is very ill,
she said sadly. Tom followed her to the king's bedroom. King Henry was in bed, and his face was white.
Here is your son, Your Majesty,
said Lady Jane. The king opened his eyes and smiled at Tom.
What's the matter, Edward? Tell your father.
Are you the king?
asked Tom, looking at the big, fat man.
Of course I'm the king. Don't you know your father?
Tom bowed.
Sir, I'm not your son. I'm not the prince. I'm poor Tom.
Stop this nonsense,
said King Henry.
You are the prince, and you will be king when I die. Now, go and rest before the banquet tonight. There'll be a lot of important men.
Tom and Lady Jane went back to the prince's room. After a short time, Lord Hertford went to see King Henry. Lord Hertford was a short, fat man with a long nose. He was the king's first lord.
Lord Hertford,
said the king.
I'm very ill, but I must continue working. I have to read and sign many papers. Where is the Great Seal?
You gave it to Prince Edward 2 days ago,
said Lord Hertford.
I'll go and get it.
Lord Hertford came back without the Great Seal, and he was worried.
Your Majesty,
he said,
the prince can't remember where it is or what it is.
He can't remember? Then he really is ill. The Great Seal is very important. Let's wait until he's better.
At 1 o'clock that afternoon, Tom had lunch. He was surprised when he saw the royal dining room with its gold furniture. Several servants stood near him while he ate. Poor Tom made a lot of mistakes that afternoon, but no one laughed because they thought he was ill. He ate with his fingers and made noises with his mouth. Then he looked at his napkin with great interest.
Please take this lovely napkin away. I don't want to make it dirty.
Then he took a lot of nuts and put them in his pockets. At the end of the meal, a servant brought a finger bowl. But Tom did not clean his fingers in it. He drank from it.
King Henry VIII. In the story you are reading, King Henry VIII is Prince Edward's father. He was one of England's most famous kings and ruled from 1509 to 1547. Who was King Henry VIII, and what did he do? Young Henry. Henry VIII was born on the 28th of June, 1491. He was a tall, good-looking man with red hair and blue eyes. He liked playing tennis, hunting, and riding horses. He also liked reading, music, and dancing. He was an intelligent man and spoke English, French, Spanish, and Latin. Henry became king when he was almost 18 and married Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of King Ferdinand of Spain. They were happy together for almost 20 years. During Henry's reign, the Renaissance developed in England. There were always many writers, poets, painters, and musicians at his court. The young king lived in beautiful castles and palaces and wore expensive clothes and jewels. King Henry wanted a son, but Catherine could not give him one. During his 20 years of marriage, 4 sons were born, but they all died. Only a daughter, called Princess Mary, survived. The king wanted a son to become king after his death. Henry meets Anne Boleyn. In 1526, Henry met Anne Boleyn. She was a young English woman with dark hair and dark eyes. Henry fell in love with her and wanted to marry her. He wanted a son from her. He decided to divorce Catherine, but he was Catholic and he needed permission from the Pope in Rome. The Pope did not give him permission, and Henry was very angry. In 1533, he chose a new Archbishop of Canterbury, called Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer believed in the complete power of the king. Soon, he helped to establish the Church of England. This church had different rules, and Henry was able to divorce Catherine. Henry and Anne Boleyn were secretly married, and Catherine left the court. In May 1533, Anne gave birth to Princess Elizabeth. Henry was unhappy with Anne because she did not give him a son. However, Princess Elizabeth later became a great queen, Queen Elizabeth I. Jane Seymour. When Henry met Jane Seymour, he fell in love with her. He was a friend of her father, Sir John Seymour of Wiltshire, and met her at her father's house. He also thought she could give him a son. Henry accused Anne of treason, and she was beheaded in 1536. Henry soon married Jane Seymour, and in 1537, Jane gave birth to a son, Prince Edward. King Henry was very happy, and everyone in England celebrated. The king finally had a son. But Queen Jane died 12 days later, and Henry was very sad. Prince Edward had the best teachers and received an excellent education. During this time, Henry built beautiful palaces, castles, and homes around England. One of these was Deal Castle in Kent. Henry built many warships, and England soon had the strongest navy in Europe. Political problems. Spain and France were Henry's enemies. He needed a strong ally, so he decided to marry a German princess called Anne of Cleves. The royal painter Hans Holbein went to Germany to paint a portrait of Anne of Cleves. Henry liked her portrait, but when she arrived in England, he was surprised because she was ugly and didn't speak English. Henry married her for political reasons and then divorced her a few months later. Health problems. In 1540, Henry was 49 and he had serious health problems. He was very fat and could not walk well. Soon after divorcing Anne of Cleves, he married a pretty girl of 19 years old called Catherine Howard. But because she had relationships with other men, Henry accused her of treason. She was beheaded in 1542. The Last Queen. Henry married his sixth and last queen in 1543. Her name was Catherine Parr, and she was a quiet, well-educated woman. She looked after Henry's 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. She was kind to them and was interested in their education. Henry was happy with her. During Henry's last years, he could not walk, and servants carried him everywhere. He also had very bad headaches. Catherine looked after him lovingly. Henry died on the 28th of January, 1547, at the age of 55. He was buried at Windsor next to his favorite wife, Jane Seymour.
Chapter 4. The Guildhall. There were long steps from Westminster Palace to the River Thames. Soldiers stood on both sides of the steps. The people of London were near the river looking at the royal barge. When Tom came out, the crowd shouted,
Long live Prince Edward!
Tom wore beautiful white clothes and jewels for the important banquet. He looked at the river and thought about his friends and his games. He walked down the stairs to the royal barge, and the lords and ladies bowed. Tom stood at the front of the barge as it moved slowly down the river to the Guildhall. He was excited because everything was new to him. The Guildhall was a big building near the river, where all the rich and important men of London were waiting for the prince. At the same time, John Canty took Edward and pulled him down Pudding Lane. People laughed and followed them.
Teach that boy a lesson!
Shouted a young woman. When they came near John Canty's house, Father Andrew stood in front of them.
Don't hurt him! Let him go!
Said Father Andrew. John Canty was angry and did not answer him. He hit Father Andrew on the head with a stick, and he fell to the ground. John Canty pulled Edward home. He opened the door of his small room and said to his wife,
Here is your dear son. He doesn't have a penny for us, and he's mad too.
Tom's mother ran to Edward and said, Oh, my poor boy!
No money, no food,
said John Canty to Edward, and he pushed him to the floor. Tom's father was a cruel man. There was a voice outside the door.
John Canty! Quick! Open the door!
What's the matter?
Said Canty.
You hit Father Andrew on the head, and now he's dead!
Said a young man.
Dead?
Asked John Canty.
This is bad. A lot of people saw me when I hit the old man.
He turned to his wife and said,
Quick! Take the girls and meet me at London Bridge. I'll take another road with the boy.
Canty took Edward by the arm and pulled him through the small, dark streets until they came to the river. There he saw a crowd of people. Some of them were sitting at tables and drinking.
What's all this?
Canty asked a man.
What are you waiting for?
Don't you know?
Said the man.
We're waiting to see Prince Edward in the royal barge. He's going to a banquet at the Guildhall. Here, have a drink.
He gave John Canty a big cup. Canty removed his hand from Edward's arm to pick up the cup. Edward quickly ran away between the men's legs. Canty looked down.
Where's the boy? Stop him! Catch him!
Edward ran away and thought,
I must go to the Guildhall and find Tom. Then we can change clothes again.
When Tom came into the Guildhall, everyone stood up and bowed. He sat at the high table with the prince's sisters and Lady Jane. Hundreds of servants brought in all kinds of food. There was a lot of meat, fish, and cheese, and many different cakes. Soon the banquet began. Everyone talked and laughed, and there were singers and dancers. Tom was surprised by everything he saw and started to enjoy the royal banquet. Edward finally reached the Guildhall, and he was tired and dirty. He went to one of the soldiers and cried,
I'm Prince Edward. Open the doors. I want to come in.
The soldier laughed at him.
I order you to open the doors,
he cried.
Don't be a fool,
said the soldier.
Stand back!
The people in the crowd were angry.
Send this boy away!
They shouted.
He's mad!
We want to see the prince when the banquet finishes!
Go away, boy!
I won't go away. I am Prince Edward. The boy in there is a pauper. I am the son of King Henry.
The crowd began to look dangerous, but Edward did not move. Then a tall man with black hair came out of the angry crowd and stood next to Edward.
Perhaps you're a prince, and perhaps you're not.
Said the man.
But you're a courageous boy, and I like you, so I'll help you.
Who are you, sir?
Asked Edward.
My name is Miles Hendon, and I'm a soldier of the King of England. I returned from France yesterday, and I'm going to my home in the country.
The dangerous crowd came nearer.
Stand back!
Cried Miles to the crowd. He took out his sword and held it up.
Kill them!
Cried someone from the back of the crowd. People started to throw things at them. Miles stood in front of Edward and defended him. The crowd was big and angry, and Miles was alone. Suddenly, everyone stopped shouting and fighting. They heard the sound of horses, and a soldier cried,
Oh, stand back! The King's First Lord is coming!
The soldiers pushed the crowd back. Lord Hertford ran up the stairs and went into the Guildhall. He went to Tom and said,
Your Majesty, I'm sorry. Your father is dead.
Then he looked at the people and shouted,
King Henry is dead! Long live King Edward!
Everyone at the banquet shouted,
Long live King Edward!
Miles Hendon quickly took Edward's arm and they ran away. Chapter 5. Sir Miles. Miles took Edward to an inn near London Bridge. People in the streets shouted,
King Henry is dead! Long live King Edward!
Edward thought of his father and became very sad and started to cry. King Henry was a difficult man, but he was always kind to him. And now he was dead. Then they heard more shouts.
Long live King Edward!
So now I am king?
He said with tears in his eyes.
Prince or king,
Said Miles.
you can stay with me tonight. We'll eat some food and rest.
Miles's room at the inn was small. There was a bed, 2 chairs, a table, and a washstand. Edward was very tired and fell on the bed.
Call me when the food is ready.
He said. Miles saw that the boy was cold and covered him with his jacket.
Yes, Your Majesty.
Said Miles, smiling. Miles went to get some food.
Your banquet is ready, Your Majesty.
Edward washed his hands and sat down at the table. Miles sat down too.
Wait,
Said Edward.
stand up. I am your king. You must wait for my orders.
Miles stood up.
Now you can sit down.
They were both hungry and started to eat. After dinner, Edward looked at Miles and said,
You are a courageous soldier of the king, and you are good to me. Give me your sword and go down on your knee.
With the side of the sword, Edward touched Miles on the shoulder.
Stand up, Sir Miles Hendon. Now you are one of my men.
Miles stood up and laughed. Edward fell asleep with his head on the table, and Miles took him to bed.
Poor boy.
He said,
Perhaps he'll be well again after a long sleep.
That night, Miles slept on the floor. The next morning, Miles looked at the boy sleeping on the bed.
The poor boy.
He thought,
He can sleep another hour, and I'll go out to the market and buy him some new clothes.
in the streets of London, everyone was talking about the new king. Miles listened to them.
People say the new king is mad,
Said an old woman.
He doesn't want to be king. He says he's a pauper.
Yes, he says it's all a mistake.
Said a young man.
The poor young king is mad, completely mad.
Said another man, laughing. Miles started thinking.
Perhaps Edward is telling me the truth. Perhaps he is the King of England.
He went back to the inn with the new clothes. When he got back to his room, he was very surprised. Edward was gone. Miles immediately went to the man at the inn and asked,
Where is the young boy?
Oh dear.
said the man.
Please don't get angry, sir.
Well, where is he?
Asked Miles angrily.
Answer my question.
The man's face became red.
When you were away, a man came and took the boy with him.
A man?
Said Miles, surprised.
Oh no. It was probably his father. The poor boy. Where did they go?
Well, sir, they went towards Southwark,
Said the man.
and they disappeared in the crowd.
Poor Edward.
Said Miles.
I must find him.
He ran out of the inn and went towards Southwark, looking for his young friend. At the same time, Edward had to follow John Canty through a forest outside London to an old barn. Inside the barn, there were many beggars, thieves, and vagabonds. John Canty knew most of them.
What strange people.
Thought Edward, looking at them silently.
Where do they come from?
Who's this boy, John?
Asked an old beggar with dirty clothes.
He's my son.
Said John Canty.
No,
Cried Edward.
I'm not his son. I'm the King of England.
Everyone in the barn started to laugh. An old beggar with long hair and no teeth said,
The King of England. He's the King of Fools.
and everyone laughed again. Edward was very sad. Soon, everyone was saying unkind things to him, and he wanted to cry, but he didn't. He went to sit in a corner and thought,
Will Miles find me here?
He was tired and hungry, and he soon fell asleep. When Edward woke up the next morning, everyone in the barn was sleeping. He quickly and quietly opened the door and ran away into the forest. He ran all the way to the first village and stopped at the market. Suddenly, he heard a voice.
Edward!
He turned around and saw Miles.
Oh, how happy I am to see you,
Said Edward, smiling.
I looked for you everywhere.
Said Miles. Edward told him about John Canty. And Miles told him what he heard at the market the day before.
I believe you, and now I know you're the king, Your Majesty.
Said Miles.
Let's go to my home, Hendon Hall. It's not far from Westminster Palace, and we can think of a plan to help you get back into the palace.
I'm glad you believe me, Sir Miles.
Said Edward. Chapter 6. The Life of a King. It was morning, and Tom woke up in a big, beautiful bed in Westminster Palace. When he opened his eyes, he saw 2 gentlemen by the side of his bed.
Your Majesty.
Said the first gentleman.
It's 8 o'clock, Your Majesty.
Said the second gentleman.
What?
Said Tom.
Does Your Majesty wish to rise?
Asked the first gentleman.
Do you mean, do I want to get up?
Yes, Your Majesty.
Yes, I do.
Said Tom.
Where are my clothes?
One gentleman brought Tom's underclothes into the room and gave them to a second gentleman. And the second gentleman gave them to a third gentleman. And the third gentleman helped Tom get into his underclothes. In this way, the gentleman dressed Tom in his expensive clothes. An hour later, he was ready. Tom went to another beautiful room to have breakfast. One servant brought the food into the room. He gave it to a second servant. The second servant gave it to a third servant, and the third servant put it on the table. A fourth servant put some food on Tom's plate. 2 other servants stood behind Tom's chair and did nothing. The servants did everything for Tom. After breakfast, a servant said,
Your Majesty, Lord Hertford wants to speak to you.
Lord Hertford came in and bowed.
Is Your Majesty ready? The men are waiting in the council chamber.
Tom went to the council chamber and sat in the king's gold chair. Men came, bowed and kissed his hand and read from long pieces of paper. It was very boring, and it went on for hours. One man talked about money.
There is no money, Your Majesty, because King Henry spent all of it. He built a lot of castles and wore expensive clothes and jewels. And his funeral was very expensive too. You have 1,000 servants and you must pay them.
Tom looked at the man and said,
We can live in a small house with only 10 servants. There is a nice house in the city near Pudding Lane.
Lord Hertford took Tom's arm gently, and Tom stopped talking. Tom's face was red.
Oh, when will this end?
He thought.
I want to play ball or swim in the river.
He had lunch in the great dining room, and the food was delicious. But he could not stop thinking about his friends and games at the river. After lunch, Tom went back to Prince Edward's room and sent everyone away. After a few minutes, a boy came in quietly.
Who are you?
Asked Tom.
Oh, Your Majesty is really ill,
Said the boy.
I'm Humphrey Marlowe. I'm your whipping boy.
My whipping boy?
Cried Tom.
Yes, Your Majesty.
Said the boy.
When you make mistakes during your Greek lesson, your teacher gets angry. But no one hits the Prince of Wales, so he hits me. That's my job. But now you're king, and perhaps you won't study Greek anymore. Then I'll lose my job and my family will be hungry. We'll live on the streets.
What?
Tom looked at the boy and laughed loudly.
Listen, Humphrey. I won't stop my studies, and I'll make a lot of mistakes. They'll pay you more than before, and you can work all your life.
Oh, thank you, Your Majesty. You're very kind.
Tom liked talking to Humphrey and learned a lot of things about Edward's life. Lord Hertford came for Tom and took him back to the council chamber.
You're feeling better, Your Majesty. I can see it. You remember more.
Said Lord Hertford.
Do you remember where the Great Seal is?
The Great Seal?
Asked Tom.
What's it like?
Oh dear,
Thought the Lord.
he's still not well.
When they reached the council chamber, Tom had to sign Edward's name on a lot of papers all afternoon. The king's job was not easy. It was a long, boring afternoon. In the evening, there was another royal dinner. And after that, Tom finally went to bed.
My clothes are beautiful, and the palace is splendid,
he thought.
The food is delicious, and now I'm never hungry. But I don't want to be king. Every day is the same. Pudding Lane is more fun.
Chapter 7. Hendon Hall. The next day, Edward rode with Miles on his horse. In the afternoon, they came to a high hill. Miles stopped and said,
Look, that's my home, among the trees. It's a very big house with 50 rooms and 20 servants.
They rode down the hill and passed through a big gate.
This is Hendon Hall.
Said Miles happily.
How glad I am to be home. My family will be so happy to see me.
Miles ran into the house and Edward followed him. There was a young man with blonde hair at a long table.
Phew!
Cried Miles.
Aren't you happy to see me? Where's Father?
The young man was unfriendly and looked at him with cold eyes.
Who are you?
Don't you know me? I'm your brother, Miles. I'm back from France after the war.
My brother died in France.
Said Hugh.
We received a letter from his friend.
No. I'm here.
Said Miles.
Where's my father? He'll know me.
He's dead.
Said Hugh.
No. Poor father.
Cried Miles.
Then call the servants. They'll know me.
All the servants are new.
Said Hugh.
You sent them away.
Cried Miles angrily.
Now I understand. You wrote the letter because you wanted the house and the money. But your plan won't work because Lady Edith will remember me.
Lady Edith knows that Miles Hendon is dead.
Said Hugh.
She's my wife now.
Miles was furious and ran across the room.
You took my home and my land. You took my money. And you also took the woman I love. I'll kill you.
He took Hugh by the shirt and pushed him against the wall angrily.
Oh, help! Help!
Shouted Hugh. The servants ran into the room and pulled Miles from him. They took Miles and Edward away to prison. The prison was a terrible place. It was dark, cold, and crowded. There were rats everywhere. Miles and Edward were chained together in a large, noisy room. Some prisoners sang, and others fought and shouted. A man hit a woman and almost killed her. Her face was covered with blood. Another woman cried loudly.
What is the matter?
Edward asked the woman. Tomorrow, the soldiers are going to hang me because I stole some cheese, she said, crying. Another sad young man spoke to Miles.
They're going to hang me because I killed a deer in the King's Park. But it's not true.
Then he started to cry.
Oh, prison's a sad, ugly place,
Said Edward.
No one helps these poor people. One day I will change these cruel laws.
No one slept that night. The next day, Miles and Edward were in front of the judge.
Why are this man and this boy here?
Asked the judge. Miles wanted to speak, but the judge said,
Be quiet.
He turned to Hugh and asked,
Why did you bring them here, Mr. Hendon?
Hugh explained his story to the judge. Then Miles tried to speak, but the judge did not listen to him.
The man must sit in the stocks for 2 hours.
Said the judge.
Then he and the boy can leave. Take them away immediately.
No!
Cried Edward.
He's my servant. You don't know what you're doing.
Be quiet, boy, or the soldiers will hit you.
Said the judge. The soldiers put Miles into the stocks. Some people stopped and looked, and others threw bad eggs at him. Edward stood in front of Miles and tried to protect him. The people laughed and said,
He's a courageous boy.
And he loves his friend.
At the end of the 2 hours, the soldiers took Miles out of the stocks and he was free. He looked at Edward and said,
Now we can finally go to London.
Chapter 8. The New King. When Miles and Edward arrived in London, they saw a crowd of people in the streets. There were flags on all of the buildings and a lot of noise everywhere. It was the 19th of February, and the next day was Coronation Day. Everyone was happy and excited. Miles and Edward were in the big crowd, and they soon got lost. They could not find each other anymore. Poor Edward was cold, hungry, and alone. Tom, on the other hand, was beginning to enjoy the royal palace, the beautiful new clothes, and the good food. Everyone bowed to him and listened to him, and he liked this. During his first days at the palace, he thought about his mother, sisters, and Edward. But as the days passed, he almost forgot about them because he liked his wonderful new life. He was happy and comfortable. The next morning was the 20th of February, Coronation Day. Tom thought,
Today, I'm going to become King of England. I'm going to wear splendid new clothes and jewels in the parade. Oh, this is wonderful!
Soon, Tom Canty was splendidly dressed and riding a tall horse in the royal parade. Behind him, there were lords and rich gentlemen dressed in their best clothes. There was music in the air and thousands of happy people in the streets of London.
Hooray for the new King of England!
They shouted. Tom smiled and often threw new coins to the people. He felt important. Suddenly, he saw his mother in the big crowd. She touched his leg and cried, "Oh, my dear child!" A soldier pushed her away. Tom looked at her and said, "I don't know you, woman." His mother was very sad and disappeared in the crowd. After a moment, Tom thought, "Oh no, what did I say?" He felt terrible, and suddenly he was unhappy. The royal parade continued down the streets of London to Westminster Abbey. The church was full of people and beautifully decorated for the great day. At last, the Archbishop of Canterbury took the crown of England and lifted it over Tom's head. Everyone was silent. Suddenly, a young boy with no shoes and old, dirty clothes ran into the church.
You're not the king! I'm the king!
He cried. Everyone was surprised, and the people looked at each other.
What's happening?
Asked one gentleman. Who's that pauper? What does he want? Asked a lady. Lord Hertford quickly said,
Soldiers, stop this boy.
Edward and Tom looked at each other for a moment.
No,
said Tom.
Don't touch him. He is the real king.
Everyone was confused. Lord Hertford looked at the two boys and said,
Look at their faces. They're identical. But who is our king?
He is the real king,
said Tom, smiling at Edward.
Ask him about the Great Seal.
Very well.
Said Lord Hertford.
Only the real king can answer this question. Where's the Great Seal?
Edward immediately said,
Look inside the old Italian suit of armour in my room. The Great Seal's there.
Lord Hertford sent Lord John to look for the Great Seal in the palace. When he returned, he said,
I found the Great Seal. Here it is. The Pauper is right. He is the king.
The Archbishop of Canterbury put the crown of England on Edward's young head. Everyone in the church stood up and cheered.
Long live young King Edward!
Tom looked at the Great Seal and said,
I used it to crack nuts. I didn't know it was the Great Seal.
He used the Great Seal of England to crack nuts?
said Lord Hertford loudly.
How funny!
All the great lords laughed and laughed. The great ceremony ended and Edward became King Edward VI. The next day, Miles went to see his friend, King Edward VI. The young king was happy to see Sir Miles, who told him more about his problems with his brother Hugh.
You were kind and helped me, Sir Miles.
Said the young king.
Now I will help you. You can go back to Hendon House because it's yours again. Your brother Hugh will give everything back to you.
Thank you, King Edward.
Said Sir Miles happily. King Edward VI was a very good and kind king, because for those few days he was a pauper. He knew his people and understood their problems. Tom Canty was the king's best friend and lived in Westminster Palace. King Edward gave Tom's mother and sisters a lovely house in the country. And no one saw John Canty again. King Edward VI died when he was only 16. Tom was very sad and left Westminster Palace. He went to live with his mother and sisters in the country. Everyone remembered the young king for a long time because he loved all of his people, the rich and the poor.